Police officers stopped a teenager right on the street, accusing him of suspicious behavior. Minutes later, things went too far. They slammed him against the hood and started beating him. But the boy managed to make one phone call. Moments later, his mother, world champion Ronda Rousey, arrived. What happened next changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The gym was almost empty by the time Caden Brown peeled the gloves off his sweating hands. The rhythmic thuds of punches that had filled the room all evening had faded, replaced by the faint hum of the air conditioner and the muffled sound of rain outside. He sat on the edge of the mat, stretching his shoulders, staring at the scuffed floor where hundreds of rounds had been fought and learned. For most kids, this was just another boxing gym. For Caden, it was his second home, a place where he could disappear from the shadow of his mother's name and simply exist as himself. He had his mother's focus and her ferocious discipline, but none of her appetite for fame. Ronda Rousey was a legend, a household name, the fighter whose stare could silence a crowd. Caden admired her strength, but fame was a fire he'd never wanted to touch. He didn't crave attention, he wanted control, mastery, a sense that what he earned was truly his. At 17, he was already taller than his mother, lean but powerful, a quiet storm behind cautious eyes. "Good work tonight," his coach Miguel Ramirez said, stepping out of the office. The older man's voice carried that mix of pride and fatigue that came from decades in combat sports. "Your footwork's cleaner. You're finally keeping your chin down. That tournament next month, you might surprise some people." Caden smiled faintly and nodded. "Thanks, coach. I'm just trying to stay sharp." Miguel studied him for a moment. "You're not just sharp, kid. You've got control. Remember, that's what matters when things get rough. Control." The word lingered as Caden showered, dressed, and checked his phone. There was a message from his mother. "Training ran late. Grab some food and head home. Love you, champ." He smiled, shaking his head at the irony of the nickname. He'd never liked being called champ. It felt borrowed, not yet earned. By the time he left the gym, the sky was a smear of dark gray, the rain having turned to a fine drizzle that shimmered under the streetlights. He climbed into his car, an old black sedan that rattled when the engine started, but had character. The drive home was 15 minutes through quiet, tree-lined streets. His hoodie was still damp from sweat, and the faint sting of bruised knuckles pulsed under his skin. He felt good, tired, centered, grounded in the steady rhythm of routine. The city around him was settling into its nightly hush. Los Angeles looked different at this hour, its edges softened, its chaos muted. He drove past closed diners, gas stations glowing under flickering lights, the occasional figure hurrying under an umbrella. The sound of rain against the windshield was calming, like the slow beat of a drum. He thought about the upcoming tournament, about the chance to prove something to himself. His mother would be there, no doubt. She always was, even when the world expected her to be somewhere bigger. She told him once that the fight outside the cage was harder, the one where you had to protect your dignity without throwing a single punch. He didn't fully understand it then. By the end of this night, he would. He turned onto a narrow road that cut through a residential area, the kind of quiet neighborhood where streetlights stood far apart and lawns looked surgically trimmed. The wipers moved back and forth with hypnotic rhythm. Then, in his rear-view mirror, he saw the glow of headlights, too close, too steady. After a few moments, red and blue lights burst to life behind him, washing the wet asphalt in pulsing color. His pulse quickened. He took a breath, steadying himself the way his mother had taught him. "If you ever get pulled over, keep your hands visible. No sudden moves. Speak calmly. Always show respect, even if it isn't returned." He slowed the car and pulled over to the curb. The rain had stopped, but the night air hung heavy with moisture. He turned down the music, rolled the window halfway, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. His chest felt tight, though he hadn't done anything wrong. 2 doors slammed behind him. Footsteps. The crunch of wet gravel. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, hitting him square in the face. "License and registration," a voice barked. It wasn't a request. Caden blinked, squinting through the glare. "Yes, sir," he said softly. "My license is in my wallet, and the registration's in the glove compartment. Can I—" "Just get it," the voice snapped. He moved slowly, his every motion exaggerated for clarity. From the corner of his eye, he saw both officers, one older, thick-necked, jaw clenched, the other younger, uncertain. The older one's name tag caught the light. Sergeant B. Miller. The younger man said T. Davis. Miller leaned closer to the window, his face inches from Caden's. The smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco drifted in with him. "Where you headed, son?" "Home, sir. From the gym." Miller's gaze drifted over the car interior, lingering on the worn dashboard and the gym bag on the passenger seat. "Pretty nice car for a kid your age. You sure it's yours?" "Yes, sir. It's registered to me. My mom bought it used last year." "Your mom, huh? What's she do?" "She's—" Caden hesitated, realizing the name might make things worse. "She works in sports." "Sports?" Miller repeated, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "What, like a personal trainer?" Caden swallowed the answer that rose in his throat. "Something like that." Behind Miller, Officer Davis shifted uneasily, his flashlight sweeping the rear seats. The beam lingered a little too long on Caden's gym bag, as if searching for an excuse. Miller leaned back and gestured sharply. "Step out of the vehicle." Caden's stomach tightened. "Did I do something wrong, sir?" "Step out of the vehicle." He obeyed, moving slowly. The rain had left the pavement slick, reflecting the flashing lights. The cold bit through his damp hoodie. He could feel the weight of both officers' eyes on him, assessing, judging, waiting for him to slip. "Hands on the hood." Caden complied. The metal was cold and wet under his palms. He stared down at his reflection in the sheen of water, distorted by the red and blue lights. Miller began to pat him down roughly, his hands pressing hard into his sides. "You got any weapons, son? Drugs? Maybe some steroids from that fancy gym of yours?" "No, sir," Caden said, voice tight. "Nothing like that." Davis stood a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably. "Sarge, he's clean," he muttered. "Check the car," Miller said, ignoring him. Davis hesitated, then went around to the passenger side and began rummaging through the gym bag. Gloves, wraps, water bottle, nothing. Caden could hear the sound of zippers, the dull thud of objects hitting the seat. When Davis returned, he shook his head. "Nothing there." Miller grunted, unsatisfied. He pressed down on Caden's shoulders, forcing him lower. "You think you're smart, huh? Keep your mouth shut and maybe we won't have a problem." The pressure on his back increased until his face nearly touched the hood. He felt his pulse hammering against the metal, the rainwater cold against his cheek. Somewhere nearby, a door opened. A woman walking her dog paused on the sidewalk. Her phone raised, the click of a camera. Miller noticed. "Ma'am," he called sharply, "move along. Police business." "I'm on a public sidewalk," she replied, voice trembling but firm. "I'm allowed to record." Davis glanced at her nervously. "Sarge!" Miller's voice dropped, low and venomous. "Then make her stop recording." Caden heard footsteps moving toward the woman. Then a small argument. The fear that had been simmering in his stomach boiled over. He tried to turn his head slightly. "Sir, please, can I?" The blow came fast and brutal. Miller's nightstick drove into his ribs, cutting off his breath. Pain exploded through his side. "Stay still," Miller snarled. "You move again. I'll make sure you don't." Caden gasped, his vision blurring. He could feel the warmth of blood where his lip had split against the metal. The night air seemed to shrink around him. Somewhere deep in his mind, a single instinct surfaced, not to fight back, not to argue, but to survive. When the officers turned away for a moment, Caden's trembling fingers brushed against his phone, half slid from his pocket. He pressed the power button twice. An emergency shortcut his mother had taught him. The phone vibrated once. Coordinates sent. A lifeline cast into the dark. As Miller shoved him against the hood again, Caden's thoughts blurred. The red and blue lights reflected across the wet pavement like twin heartbeats. He tried to breathe, tried to stay conscious. He didn't know if his mother was awake or if she'd see the signal in time, but he believed she would. He closed his eyes and held on to that belief as the sound of rain returned, soft and steady, washing the blood from the car's hood and carrying the echo of everything yet to come. The air smelled like wet asphalt and fear. The red and blue lights still pulsed across the empty street, bouncing off the glistening pavement, painting Caden's face in alternating flashes of color. His breathing was ragged, short bursts that fogged in the cool night air. The metallic taste of blood lingered on his tongue. He wanted to believe the nightmare would end if he just cooperated, if he stayed still, if he didn't give them a reason to hurt him more. But the longer he stayed pressed against the hood, the more he understood that reason didn't matter tonight. Sergeant Miller's heavy boots shifted on the wet road behind him. "You think I'm stupid, boy?" he growled. "You think you can mouth off to me? Send little signals on that phone of yours?" Caden froze. He hadn't realized the officer had noticed. "Sir, I didn't—" The words cut off as Miller grabbed him by the collar and yanked him upright. The world spun, the flashing lights burning into his eyes. Miller's face was too close, his breath hot and sour. "Don't you lie to me. You fit the profile. Every damn one of you thinks you can play innocent." "I didn't do anything wrong," Caden said, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay calm. "Wrong place, wrong attitude," Miller sneered. "That's all it takes." Behind them, Officer Davis stood near the open passenger door of Caden's car, his flashlight darting uncertainly between the seats. His hands shook. He didn't like this. That much was clear. But fear of his superior held him in place like a chain. He had joined the force believing he would protect people, but nights like this made him wonder who the real criminals were. "Sergeant," Davis said quietly, "maybe we should call it in. Run his license. He's just a kid." Miller turned on him, eyes narrowing. "You questioning me now?" "No, sir," Davis muttered, lowering his gaze. "Then keep your damn mouth shut." Miller shoved Caden back against the car. The impact sent a jolt through his chest. Caden's reflection blurred on the slick, metal eyes wide, mouth slightly open, every muscle trembling between terror and restraint. He remembered his mother's voice again from the first time she taught him to spar. "The moment you lose control, you lose the fight. Control your breathing, control your fear." He tried to inhale slowly, to find rhythm, but each time he drew breath, Miller's words cut through it. "What's in the trunk, huh? You hiding something? Drugs? Stolen goods?" "Nothing, sir," Caden whispered. "Please check it." Miller smirked. "Oh, I will." He motioned to Davis. "Open it." The trunk creaked open, revealing only a folded GI uniform, a spare pair of sneakers, and a small first aid kit. Davis looked at it for a long time, then back at Miller. "It's empty, Sarge." Miller's jaw tightened. "Then he dumped it somewhere." "I didn't." "Shut up!" Miller's shout echoed off the houses. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance. Curtains moved in the windows. Neighbors were watching now, unseen but aware. Caden's chest rose and fell faster. Every instinct told him to run, but running meant death. He tried to steady his thoughts, but the pain in his ribs throbbed with every heartbeat. Miller circled him like a predator, sizing up prey. "You think you can disrespect me? You think being polite makes you innocent? I've seen 100 like you. You people learn respect the hard way." Caden flinched as the officer's hand brushed his neck, shoving his head down. The cold metal of the hood met his cheek again. Miller leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "I could say you resisted arrest, and nobody would doubt it. You understand that?" Caden said nothing. Silence was the only defense he had left. Then a woman's voice pierced the night. "Hey, I'm recording this!" Miller straightened, startled for a second, then turned toward the source. The woman from before had stepped closer to the sidewalk, her phone raised high. The trembling beam of its flashlight illuminated her face. Middle-aged, frightened, but resolute. "Ma'am, back up now," Miller barked. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "He's just a kid. You're hurting him." Miller's face darkened. He took one step toward her, but Davis intervened. "Sarge, leave it. She's not doing anything illegal." "Hortois. Davis, get her off my scene." "She's within her rights," Davis said, more firmly this time. "We're not supposed to—" Miller spun on him, fury in his eyes. "You think you know procedure better than me, rookie?" Davis swallowed, his courage faltering. "No, sir." Miller turned back toward Caden, breathing heavily, rage now fully unleashed. You want to make a scene, kid? Fine. Let's make one. Before Caden could react, Miller shoved him harder into the car. The edge of the hood dug into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs. He gasped, coughing, but the officer didn't stop. A blow from the baton struck his thigh. Another landed across his back. "Stop!" Davis shouted, stepping forward. "Sarge, that's enough!" Miller ignored him. "Hands where I can see them!" He barked even as Caden's hands were pinned and cuffed. "Stop resisting!" "I'm not resisting!" Caden's voice cracked. "Please stop!" The night was filled with shouting, the thud of the baton, the cries of the woman recording, the low hum of an approaching siren somewhere far away. Davis hesitated only a moment longer before stepping in and grabbing Miller's arm. "That's enough," he said again, louder. "You're crossing the line." Miller froze, his eyes wild, his face red. For a tense second, the two officers stared at each other. Then Miller wrenched his arm free and pointed a finger in Davis's face. "You just threw your career away, kid. You hear me? You're done." Davis stepped back, shaking, unable to look at Caden. "Then maybe it's worth it." Miller cursed under his breath, turning away. He stalked toward the patrol car, muttering about paperwork and disrespect. Caden remained slumped against the hood, trembling. The cuffs bit into his wrists. His chest ached where the baton had struck him. He could hear his own pulse drumming in his ears. The woman with the phone approached slowly, staying on the sidewalk. "I called for help," she said softly. "They're sending another unit." Caden wanted to thank her, but his voice wouldn't come. His lips moved, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. Davis knelt beside him, unlocking one cuff but leaving the other attached to the car. "Just stay still, okay?" he said quietly. "They'll be here soon." Caden looked at him, eyes glassy with pain and confusion. "Why is he doing this?" Davis shook his head. "Because he can." The sound of distant sirens grew louder. Miller cursed again and slammed his car door, sitting behind the wheel, trying to compose a report in his head that would make this look justified. Davis stood nearby, his hands shaking. Caden's vision blurred, but through the haze he thought he saw something. A glint of headlights turning onto the street, steady and fast. His heart leapt. He didn't know if it was an ambulance, another patrol, or something else. But instinct told him this was the moment his message had reached its mark. Miller noticed too. "Great," he muttered, stepping out again. "More damn eyes." As the vehicle approached, the rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, until it drummed against the cars and the road like distant applause. Caden lifted his head slightly, trying to see through the blur. The approaching headlights cut through the storm, powerful and unwavering. And then he knew. The SUV stopped with a hiss of brakes, and before anyone could react, the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, moving with a calmness that made both officers hesitate. She wore a dark jacket, her hood down, her hair wet from the rain. Her posture was steady, her steps deliberate, like someone walking into a familiar arena. Ronda Rousey's eyes took in the scene. The blood on her son's face, the cuffs, the officer's stance. The muscles in her jaw tightened, but her voice, when it came, was level. "What are you doing to my son?" Miller's face paled for the first time that night. He recognized her. Everyone did. But the realization came too late. Caden's body trembled as relief and disbelief mingled inside him. Through swollen lips, he whispered one word. "Mom." The storm had truly begun. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The rain fell in silvery threads through the glare of the flashing police lights, and Ronda Rousey stood motionless in the middle of the street, her boots splashing in shallow puddles as she stared at the scene before her. Her son was bent over the hood of a police car, one wrist still cuffed, his lip bleeding, his body trembling under the cold. Behind him stood two officers, one older, heavy-set, with rage still simmering in his face, and the other young and visibly shaken. The street smelled of wet concrete and gasoline. The air crackled with tension. Ronda didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her silence carried weight. Every move she made was deliberate, controlled. The same focus she once brought to the cage now lived in her stillness. She looked first at Caden, then at the officers. Her jaw flexed once before she spoke. What are you doing to my son? Sergeant Miller straightened, instantly defensive. Ma'am, back up. This is a police operation. An operation? Her tone was calm, but the words sliced through the night like a blade. You call beating up a 17-year-old an operation? Ma'am, step back before I... You'll what? She said, her eyes fixed on his. You've already done enough damage. The younger officer, Davis, shifted uneasily, glancing between them. He seemed to shrink under Rhonda's stare. Sarge, he murmured, maybe we should just... Quiet, Miller barked, not taking his eyes off Rhonda. He reached for his radio, but his hand trembled slightly. He knew who she was. Everyone did. The woman who'd broken bones for a living, who'd fought her way from Olympic mats to sold-out arenas, who'd stood across from men twice her size and never flinched. But what unsettled him now wasn't her reputation. It was the fury in her eyes, the kind that came only from a mother seeing her child hurt. Rhonda took another step forward, rain dripping from her jacket. Take the cuffs off him. Ma'am, you're interfering with police. She cut him off with a low, sharp tone. Take them off. Davis hesitated, his fingers twitching toward his belt, but Miller grabbed his arm. Don't you dare, he hissed. I'm in charge here. Rhonda's gaze flicked to the deep red mark around Caden's wrist, where the cuff bit into his skin. His shoulders were shaking, his breath uneven. She could see he was in pain, and the sight hollowed something inside her. The part of her that had learned patience, the part that always measured her next move, began to crack. Did he resist arrest? She asked quietly. He was acting suspicious, Miller said. What did he do? Miller hesitated. We had reason to believe. You had no reason, she snapped. The words came fast, sharp, the sound of restraint unraveling. You had a boy driving home from the gym. You had my son bleeding on your hood. And you think that's reason enough? Lady, I don't care who you are, Miller said, stepping forward. Step back before I make you. That was the last line he should have crossed. He reached out, shoving her shoulder to move her back. The contact was brief but electric, and in that single instant, the air changed. Rhonda's hand moved before she even registered the motion. She caught his wrist mid-push, turned, and redirected his weight the way she'd done thousands of times in her fighting days. The movement was fluid, effortless, a dancer's grace mixed with a predator's precision. Miller's balance broke, his legs slipping out from under him, and within a second he was on the ground, his arm pinned behind his back. The wet pavement echoed the impact. The young officer stumbled backward, hand hovering near his holster, eyes wide with disbelief. Ma'am, please stop! Rhonda didn't look at him. Then take off the cuffs, she said, her voice still eerily steady. Now. Davis froze for a heartbeat, then nodded and hurried to Caden. His hands trembled as he unlocked the cuff and stepped back. Caden lifted his arm, rubbing his bruised wrist, staring at his mother with a mix of shock and awe. Miller groaned on the ground, cursing through gritted teeth. You're under arrest, he spat. You assaulted an officer. Rhonda released his arm and rose to her feet, her eyes locked on him. You assaulted my son, she said softly. By now, several people had gathered near the sidewalk. Phones were raised, cameras recording, voices whispering. The rain continued to fall, soaking through clothes and hair, but no one moved. They all knew they were watching something that would end up on every screen in America by morning. Miller struggled to stand, his uniform streaked with dirt and rainwater. He reached for his weapon, but Davis stepped in front of him. Don't, he said, his voice breaking. Just don't. She didn't start this, Sarge, you did. Miller's face twisted with fury. You're finished, Davis. Maybe, the young man said quietly, but I'm not going to shoot a mother standing next to her kid. The sound of approaching sirens filled the street again. More patrol cars, maybe an ambulance. Red and blue light multiplied, reflecting in every puddle, every window. Rhonda turned back to Caden. He looked dazed, his eyes unfocused, his body hunched with exhaustion and pain. She took his face in her hands, checking for bruises, for signs of something worse. I'm okay, he whispered, but his voice trembled. Mom, don't get in trouble because of me. She shook her head. You didn't do anything wrong. Remember that. The sirens grew louder, closer, until several cars screeched to a stop around them. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands that blurred together. Davis raised his hands immediately. "It's under control." "Weshun," he shouted. "Nobody's armed. The suspect's unarmed." Ronda stayed still, her hands visible, but her stance never lost its quiet readiness. Years of instinct refused to fade. She stood slightly in front of Caden, shoulders squared, feet firm on the slick pavement, a shield between her son and the chaos around them. A senior officer stepped forward, confusion flickering across his face as he recognized her. "Ronda Rousey?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Miller, now standing again, pointed at her with trembling hands. "She attacked me. She broke my wrist." The officer glanced at Davis. "Is that true?" Davis hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "No, sir. That's not what happened." The senior officer frowned, lowering his weapon slightly. The scene had turned from confrontation to something else, a slow, uneasy reckoning. The rain began to ease, turning to mist. Ronda exhaled, her adrenaline ebbing, replaced by a steady pulse of anger and sorrow. She turned once more to Caden, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "We're going home," she said quietly. "Not so fast," Miller snapped, clutching his wrist. "She's not going anywhere." "Enough," the senior officer said sharply. "We'll sort this out at the station." He looked at Ronda again, this time with something almost like respect. "Ma'am, please, just come with us, for now." Ronda didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze never leaving her son. Two paramedics approached, checking Caden's injuries, and she watched every movement, every gesture, ensuring he was treated gently. As the officers led her toward the patrol car, people on the sidewalk murmured her name. Phones recorded her every step. Ronda didn't flinch from the cameras. She looked straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Inside the patrol car, through the rain-streaked window, she could see Caden speaking to the medics, his lips moving slowly, his eyes following her. He didn't cry. Neither did she. The connection between them didn't need words. Somewhere behind her, Miller was shouting again, threatening lawsuits, demanding backup, insisting he'd been the victim. But his voice was fading beneath the hum of engines, the whisper of rain, and the quiet resolve that had already begun to spread through the watching crowd. By the time the car began to move, the first news vans were already on their way. The story had just begun, and by morning the whole country would know what had happened on that quiet suburban street. The night a mother came for her son, and nothing was ever the same again. The inside of the patrol car was cold, and the faint smell of rain-soaked fabric mixed with the sterile scent of plastic and metal. Ronda sat quietly, her wrists restrained but her mind sharp, focused. Through the window she could see the street still flashing with red and blue light, her son sitting on the curb as paramedics spoke softly to him. His face was pale, but he was conscious. That was all that mattered now. The rain had thinned to a mist, and steam rose from the wet asphalt, curling through the light beams like ghosts of what had just happened. She could still feel the officer's hand on her shoulder, the weight of his push, the instinctive surge of anger that followed. She hadn't planned to fight. It wasn't about pride or violence. It was about something much deeper, a primal reaction, the unthinking need to protect. Every mother carried it, but few knew how dangerous it could be when mixed with years of training. Now, as the car began to move, she wondered not if she was right to act, but what would come next. At the station, the air was heavy with murmurs. Officers stared as she was led through the entrance, their eyes widening as they recognized her. Some looked stunned, others curious, a few resentful. Fame, she had long ago learned, didn't protect you. It only magnified whatever happened to you. A young officer uncuffed her, avoiding her gaze as he mumbled something about procedure. Ronda said nothing. She sat down at the metal table in the interrogation room, her soaked jacket clinging to her shoulders. Minutes passed. Then the door opened, and Sergeant Miller walked in with his arm in a temporary sling, face flushed with anger. Behind him followed Captain Walker, a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked at Ronda with a complicated expression, part recognition, part calculation. "Ms. Rousey," he began, setting a folder on the table, "we're in a difficult situation here. Sergeant Miller claims you assaulted him during an arrest. I defended my son from being beaten, she said evenly. There's a difference. Miller leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. You think you're above the law because you're famous? Your boy resisted. I followed protocol. Rhonda's gaze was steady. Your protocol includes slamming a child's face into a car hood? Walker raised a hand. That's enough, both of you. He turned to Ronda. There are multiple recordings circulating online already. This incident has gone viral. I have no choice but to book you, pending investigation. I understand, she said calmly. Miller scoffed. Oh, you'll understand better when the charges stick. Ronda met his glare, her voice low but unshaken. They won't. Outside, the news cycle had already begun. The first videos had hit social media before Ronda even reached the station. Millions of views within an hour. Some clips showed only the takedown Miller on the ground, her standing over him, drenched in rain and fury. Others showed more. Caden's bruised face, the moment she demanded the cuffs removed, Davis stepping in to stop his superior. The story split the internet in two. To some, she was a hero, the embodiment of a mother's strength. To others, she was a celebrity who had attacked law enforcement. Caden was kept in a separate room while his statement was taken. He was quiet, trying to replay every moment without breaking down. When the paramedics left, a social worker sat beside him, asking gentle questions he could barely process. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was terrified for her. He had never seen his mother lose control before. To him, she was indestructible, always calm, always rational. But tonight had proven that even legends bleed when family is at stake. The door opened, and Officer Davis stepped in. He looked uncomfortable, torn between duty and conscience. Caden, he said softly, your mother's fine. She's being processed right now, but she'll be out soon. Caden nodded, eyes downcast. Why did he do that to me? Davis hesitated. Because he thought he could. Because some people forget what that badge is supposed to mean. Are you going to tell the truth? Caden asked. Davis looked at the floor. Yeah, I think it's time I do. By dawn, Ronda was released on bail. Outside the station, dozens of cameras were already waiting. The flash bulbs burst like tiny explosions as she stepped into the early morning light, flanked by her attorney and her longtime coach, Jean LaBelle, who had arrived as soon as he'd seen the footage. Reporters shouted questions. Did you really attack the officer? Was your son resisting? Do you think your fame gives you privilege? But she kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. She spotted Caden near the car, his hood pulled up, his face pale but composed. When he saw her, he rushed forward, and she opened her arms without hesitation. He pressed his forehead against her shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The cameras kept flashing, but the noise of the world faded into the background. That evening, the media storm reached its peak. News anchors replayed the footage endlessly, dissecting every frame, every motion of her hand, every syllable she had spoken. Commentators debated whether she was justified, whether the officers had gone too far, whether a mother's instinct excused a fighter's strength. Across social media, the hashtags spread like wildfire. Justice for Caden, Ronda vs. the system, protect our kids. In a small apartment across town, Officer Davis sat at his kitchen table, his uniform jacket draped over the chair, his phone buzzing with messages from colleagues warning him to stay quiet. He scrolled through the video again, watching himself step between Miller and Ronda, hearing his own voice shouting, "That's enough." He knew what he had to do. The next morning, he walked into Internal Affairs and filed a formal statement. Within days, the department's walls began to crack. Records surfaced of previous complaints against Sergeant Miller excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports, all buried under internal review. The city's news outlets began to dig deeper, uncovering a pattern that went back years. Public pressure mounted. Federal authorities took notice. When the FBI officially opened an inquiry, Ronda and Caden were asked to give testimony. Sitting in a conference room with federal agents, Ronda spoke clearly, without anger but with unshakable conviction. She described everything from the moment she arrived to the instant she was pushed. Caden's account followed, quiet and steady, his voice shaking only when he recalled the sound of his head hitting the car. Afterward, one of the agents, a woman with kind eyes, turned to Ronda. "You know, your actions could have gone a lot worse. You could have been shot." Ronda nodded. "I know, but I couldn't stand there and do nothing." The agent paused. "You may have just exposed something much bigger than you think." For the first time in days, Ronda allowed herself to breathe. Not in relief, but in purpose. What began as a mother's instinct had become something else, a reckoning she hadn't sought but wouldn't run from. The weeks that followed blurred into interviews, hearings, and endless statements. The public debate refused to die down. Miller was suspended pending investigation, and Davis, though ostracized by some of his peers, was quietly hailed as a whistleblower. The department's leadership faced mounting pressure from the city council and the media. Through it all, Ronda stayed silent in public. Her attorney advised her to avoid interviews, but her silence spoke louder than any words. People projected their own meanings onto it: defiance, dignity, guilt, strength. But the truth was simpler. She was saving her energy for the fight that mattered most: the courtroom. On the night before the trial began, she stood on her porch watching the city lights in the distance. Caden joined her, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "Do you think they'll believe us?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "It's not about belief. It's about truth. And truth always has a way of breaking through, no matter how hard people try to bury it." He nodded, then leaned against her side. For a long time they stood in silence, mother and son, the rain clouds breaking apart overhead. The storm had passed, but the air still carried its scent: wet asphalt, iron, and electricity. Somewhere deep inside, Ronda knew that this was only the calm before the next battle. And when it came, she would be ready. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and anxiety. Outside, a storm of cameras waited, their flashes flickering like lightning against the marble steps. Reporters shouting questions that dissolved into noise as Ronda Rousey and her son stepped through the doors. It had been nearly 2 months since that night on the street, and though time had dulled the bruises on Caden's skin, it had not softened the ache behind his eyes. The case had become a national spectacle, a symbol, some said, of a mother's defiance. To others, a dangerous act of vigilante arrogance. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Rows of journalists filled the benches, their pens scratching across notepads as the judge entered. Ronda sat beside her attorney, her face composed, eyes steady. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a plain black suit that matched the gravity of the day. Caden sat directly behind her, his hands clasped tightly, his knuckles pale. The prosecution painted her as reckless, a celebrity who believed she could live above the law. They described her as volatile, trained to inflict harm, and aware of her physical superiority. Their words were sharp, rehearsed, designed to chip away at the image of a mother protecting her child and replace it with one of a fighter unable to control her temper. Her lawyer, David Calder, countered calmly, methodically. "My client did not attack an officer," he said in his opening statement. "She defended her son from unjustified brutality. What you'll see in this courtroom is not an act of violence, it's an act of protection." The video evidence was played next. The footage filled the monitors, showing the rain-slicked street, the flashing lights, the cruel angle of Caden's body pinned against the hood. Gasps rippled through the courtroom when Miller struck him with the baton. The moment Ronda appeared, moving with impossible precision, disarming the officer with 2 swift motions, played like a scene from a film. But this was no performance. The silence that followed was heavy, unspoken judgment pressing down on the prosecution's table. Then came the witnesses. The woman who had filmed the incident took the stand first. She was nervous but resolute. "He wasn't resisting," she said firmly. "The boy didn't even move. That officer was beating him. She glanced at Ronda. "She saved him." Miller sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his arm still bandaged, though everyone knew the injury had long since healed. When his turn came to testify, he tried to speak with authority, but his tone was brittle. "She assaulted me," he insisted. "She came out of nowhere. She's dangerous." "Did the boy resist arrest?" the judge asked. Miller hesitated. "He moved his arm." The courtroom stirred. Calder leaned forward. You mean he flinched after you struck him with a baton? I did what I had to do, Miller said, but his confidence faltered. Sweat gathered at his temple. When Officer Davis took the stand, the air changed. He looked younger than he had on the night of the incident, the weight of what he carried etched across his face. I was there, he began. Sergeant Miller ordered the stop. The kid wasn't doing anything wrong. I didn't intervene soon enough. The prosecution tried to discredit him. You're a rookie officer, aren't you, Davis? Maybe you misread the situation. I know what I saw, he said, voice trembling but firm. And I know what I heard. The things Sergeant Miller said to that kid no officer should ever talk that way to anyone. Calder nodded slowly. So you're saying Sergeant Miller's account of that night is false? I'm saying, Davis replied, meeting the judge's gaze, that Sergeant Miller lost control. And if Ms. Rousey hadn't stepped in, that boy might not have walked away from that night. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. Miller turned red, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. But the damage was done. As the days passed, more evidence surfaced. Internal Affairs revealed a string of complaints against Miller that had been quietly buried over the years, allegations of excessive force, intimidation, and misconduct. Several victims came forward, their stories echoing the same pattern of violence and falsified reports. The case was no longer about Ronda's actions alone. It had become a window into something rotten at the core of the department. Caden was called to the stand on the fourth day. His voice was soft at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke. He told me I fit a profile, he said. I didn't know what that meant. I just knew I couldn't move, or he'd hit me again. He paused, glancing at his mother. When she showed up, I thought it was over. I thought she'd talk to them, make it stop. But when he pushed her, something changed. I've seen my mom fight in cages on TV, but this wasn't that. She wasn't angry, she was protecting. Calder approached gently. Caden, do you believe your mother did the right thing? Yes, he said simply. If she hadn't done what she did, I might not be here. His words hung in the air, a raw truth that no one could dismiss. The courtroom fell into complete silence, broken only by the scratch of a pen on paper. When closing arguments came, the prosecution clung to the claim that the law must be upheld, that civilians cannot take justice into their own hands. But Calder's final statement cut through their rhetoric. The law exists to protect people, not to excuse the abuse of power. My client didn't break the law, she reminded it of its purpose. The jury deliberated for nearly 7 hours. Ronda sat motionless the entire time. Caden beside her, his hand resting on hers. When the jurors finally returned, the tension was unbearable. The forewoman stood, paper trembling in her hands. On the charge of assaulting an officer, we find the defendant, Ronda Rousey, not guilty. The sound that followed was a collective exhale, a release of breath that had been held for weeks. Ronda closed her eyes briefly, her fingers tightening around Caden's. Miller slumped in his chair, pale and silent. The judge's gavel struck once, signaling the end. But the real impact of the verdict rippled far beyond the room. Outside, the crowd erupted. Supporters cheered, chanting her name, holding signs that read, "Justice for Caden and accountability now." Reporters flooded the steps again, but this time the tone had changed. She was no longer the aggressor. They called her the mother who stood up to a corrupt system. In the days that followed, Miller was formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, obstruction, and falsifying reports. The department launched an internal overhaul. Officer Davis was quietly reassigned but became a key witness in the federal investigation that soon followed. Ronda avoided interviews, but the world spoke for her. Editorials called her a symbol of courage, others of reform, and though she rejected both titles, she understood the power of what had happened. The story was no longer about her. It was about every parent who had felt powerless, every family that had been silenced. At night, she and Caden would sit together on the back porch, the hum of the city distant and low. He was healing, his bruises fading, but the memory lingered. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, he turned to her and asked, "Do you think people will really change after all this?" She looked at him for a long moment, the faintest smile crossing her lips. Change doesn't happen all at once. But sometimes it takes one night, one mistake, one act of defiance to make the world stop pretending it doesn't see. He leaned against her shoulder, and for the first time since that night, she felt the tension in his body ease. The fight wasn't over. There would be appeals, statements, reforms, but the verdict had done something no punch or headline ever could. It had proven that truth, no matter how delayed, still had a voice. Ronda glanced at the stars emerging above the darkening sky. She had fought hundreds of battles in her life, but none like this. And though she was exhausted, she knew it was worth every bruise, every sleepless night, every tear her son had shed. The law had seen them not as enemies, but as people. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a breath of peace. The war outside had quieted, but inside her something else was awakening. Not vengeance, but purpose. This was not the end of her fight. It was only the beginning. The months that followed the verdict unfolded like the slow thaw after a brutal winter. For the first time in what felt like years, the air around Ronda and Caden carried a stillness that wasn't weighted by fear or anger. The world outside their quiet neighborhood had moved on to new headlines. But for them, the echoes of that night still lingered in ways that couldn't be erased by court victories or television apologies. Caden had returned to school, though it wasn't easy. The stares followed him at first, some filled with sympathy, others with envy, a few with barely hidden resentment. But over time, the noise faded, replaced by quiet respect. Teachers treated him differently now, as if he'd aged 10 years in a few months. In some ways he had. He'd taken to spending long hours at the gym again, the rhythm of training grounding him in a way nothing else could. The sound of fists striking pads, the smell of sweat and rubber mats. It gave him a sense of control, a reminder that strength wasn't always about fighting, but about surviving. Ronda often watched him from the sidelines, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She corrected his form occasionally, but mostly she let him find his rhythm on his own. One evening, as the gym lights dimmed, Caden glanced over at her between rounds. "You're thinking too much again," he said, breathing hard, sweat glistening across his forehead. She smiled faintly. "You sound like your grandfather." He was right, though. "You don't know how to stop fighting." "I do," she replied softly. "I just haven't had a reason to yet." Outside, the world had begun to shift. The footage of the assault, the trial, and the revelations that followed had ignited something larger, a movement demanding accountability in law enforcement, new training protocols, and community oversight. Ronda had been asked to speak at rallies and conferences, invited onto talk shows, and offered book deals. She declined them all. It wasn't about fame. It had never been. But when she was approached by a group of activists and lawyers who wanted to launch an initiative for police reform named Project Guardian, she finally said yes. Her role was not as a figurehead, but as a builder. She met with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, listened to their stories, and helped them navigate a system designed to silence them. She didn't make speeches. She sat in living rooms and listened. The strength of her name gave weight to their voices, and her presence brought a sense of legitimacy that politicians couldn't easily dismiss. In one meeting, a mother from Chicago broke down as she described how her teenage son had been killed during a routine stop. Her voice trembled with exhaustion and rage, the same emotions Ronda had once buried deep inside. Ronda reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not alone anymore," she said quietly. "We're going to make them listen." Caden watched his mother evolve during those months. The fighter who had once thrived in arenas filled with cheers was now standing in courtrooms and city halls. Her battles quieter, but no less fierce. He saw how people looked at her, with reverence, gratitude, sometimes disbelief. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had nothing left to prove, yet everything left to protect. But the attention came at a cost. There were threats, anonymous letters, online vitriol, even the occasional vandalism outside their home. Ronda never let Caden see how much it worried her, but sometimes late at night, she would sit by the window, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fence line. She wasn't afraid, but she was aware. The system she had challenged was wounded, and wounded systems often lash out before they change. The first major reform came 6 months after the trial. The city council passed a policy requiring all officers to undergo de-escalation and empathy training, with independent civilian oversight panels established to review complaints. It wasn't perfect, and Ronda knew policy alone couldn't erase prejudice, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Officer Davis became an unlikely hero. He was promoted quietly, assigned to community outreach, where he worked directly with youth programs. One afternoon, he visited Ronda's gym, dressed in plain clothes, and found Caden practicing alone. For a long moment, he simply watched. When Caden noticed him, he froze, his body tensing instinctively. "I'm not here on duty," Davis said quickly, raising his hand slightly. "I just wanted to see how you're doing." Caden studied him carefully, then nodded. "Better. Thanks to you." The officer hesitated. "No, thanks to your mom. She made me remember why I joined the force in the first place." They spoke for nearly an hour. It wasn't a comfortable conversation, but it was honest. When Davis left, Caden watched him go, realizing that some people could change if given the chance and the courage to do it. As spring turned to summer, invitations poured in for Ronda to speak at universities, leadership summits, and police academies. She refused most, but accepted an address at a national conference on justice reform in Washington, D.C. She brought Caden with her. The auditorium was packed with officers, community leaders, and young activists. When she took the stage, she paused for a long time before speaking. "I never set out to be a symbol," she began. "I was just a mother protecting her child. But the truth is, we shouldn't have to fight to be treated like human beings. Accountability isn't an attack on the police. It's a defense of what the badge should stand for. Every officer who does their job with honor deserves trust. But trust isn't given, it's earned. And it's lost every time someone like Sergeant Miller abuses his power." Her voice grew steadier as she continued, the crowd hanging on every word. "This isn't a war between citizens and police. It's a call to remember that we are supposed to be on the same side. Justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about truth." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Ronda barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on Caden, seated in the front row, his eyes bright with pride. He wasn't just her reason for fighting anymore, he was her proof that fighting could mean something more than survival. Months later, when the foundation of Project Guardian opened its first community center, Ronda named it the Caden House for Justice and Training. It was a place where young people could learn self-defense, conflict resolution, and civic rights, a blend of everything she and her son had lived through. At the ribbon cutting, Caden stood beside her, taller now, more confident. "You think this will really help?" he asked quietly as the crowd applauded. She smiled. "It already is. Look around you." He did. Families of all backgrounds, officers in uniform, former detainees, children laughing as they practiced drills. It was imperfect, messy, and human. But it was change, real and visible. That night, after everyone had left, Ronda walked alone through the training hall. The mats smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, just like the gym where she had built her career. On one wall hung a framed photograph of her and Caden the day after the trial, standing hand in hand, both smiling for the first time in months. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Strength is not in how hard we fight, but in why we choose to." Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The world hadn't become perfect. There were still headlines about brutality, still protests, still grief. But she felt something different now. The darkness wasn't as heavy, and the light, though fragile, was spreading. Ronda stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Across the street, Caden was waiting by the car, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "Ready to go?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, let's go home." As they drove through the quiet streets, Ronda glanced at him. His face was calm, his eyes on the road ahead. For the first time in a long while, she saw not the boy from that night, but a young man who had walked through fire and come out stronger. The city lights flickered past them, fading into the horizon. The fight had changed both of them, reshaping their lives in ways neither could have foreseen. But as the car disappeared into the darkness, one truth remained unshakable. No matter how deep the injustice, no matter how long the struggle, There would always be those willing to stand, to speak, and to protect what was right. And sometimes that stand began not in courtrooms or on battlefields, but on a quiet street, under a storm, with a mother who refused to let her son be broken. If this story hit you hard, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming next. I've got more unbelievable true style stories you need to see. Watch the next video on your screen and share this one with your friends. Let everyone see what justice really looks like.